So a few days ago, polyglot Steve Kaufmann made a video about perfectionism and how perfectionism can actually hurt when it comes to learning a language. And we're going to talk about what he said in that video, but I'm also going to add my own opinions based on what I notice from students learning English and how perfectionism kind of hampers them from moving forward. So we're going to focus on that toward the end of the video because honestly, perfectionism can be extremely detrimental to learning not just English, but any language, and maybe even other aspects of learning something. So, if you want to learn how to play the guitar, if you're sitting there saying, I want to be Jimi Hendrix on day one, you're probably not going to be Jimi Hendrix. You have to go through a process of learning. So, let's go ahead and talk about perfectionism. But before we do, if you're ever interested in taking one-on-one lessons with me, please go to justsayitenglish.com and I can help you with your English learning needs. I'm a professional English teacher and teach students one-on-one. All right, so let's go into the Kaufmann video. So Steve Kaufmann makes a lot of points in this video, but I want to really focus on two that he makes that I think are very, very important. So the first one he talks about is that learning a language basically requires making mistakes. That in language learning, the way we learn how grammar works or vocabulary pronunciation works is to be exposed to it through error correction. Now, let me give you my own example when I was in France many years ago. I knew that the word emporter was like to take out, but I went to a Vietnamese restaurant and I said importer, importer. The lady corrected me, said emporter. I'm like, okay, emporter. I got it now. That has stuck in my mind since. And the more and more you get exposed and you actually have the error corrected, the more and more you'll remember, it's not this, it's this. And eventually you'll even forget that it's not this. You'll just automatically say the correct word.
In language learning, on the other hand, errors are good, mistakes are good. And I've referred to it in the past, this probabilistic, error-driven process of how we as humans acquire language, which is in fact very similar to how AI, artificial intelligence, uses massive exposure to language to come up with increasingly accurate, ability to answer questions and so forth.
And Steve Kaufmann mentions this. He says that we really need to have error correction to learn the language because on day one, you're not going to be perfect in language. And I hate to say this, you can't be perfect in English because it is not a regulated language. It is very, very much a subject language. It's up to people's subjective opinion as to whether something's right or something's wrong. And because we have British English, Irish English, Australian English, all types of English, it's even more subjective. So trying to be perfect immediately hinders the ability to learn from your errors, and that's extremely important when learning a language. Now, the second thing Kaufmann mentions that I agree with that I think is extremely bad to language learning is that if we learned English or another language in school or at university, we get punished if we make a mistake. So we will take an exam, and once we take the exam, if we do very poorly, we will get punished with a bad grade. That bad grade then goes on to our other grades that reflect how well we do in a subject.
Now, it is true that we can react in different ways to our errors. We can be saddened by them. We can be upset by them. I think to some extent, traditional language teaching at schools makes us wary of making mistakes since we get the tests, and if we make more mistakes, we get poorer marks. So it conditions us to not like errors. However, if we understand that the driver of our learning is our mistakes, in other words, if we use a word incorrectly, if we misunderstand something, if the sentence that comes at us has a word in there that we didn't expect, or when we go to speak, we stumble, all of those gaps in our expectations actually help us learn gradually, slowly.
These schools actually program us to think that if we want to know a language, we have to be perfect because we're still thinking of the system of if I say something incorrectly, I'm going to be punished like I am on an exam or a test. But that's not how interaction with people work. As I just mentioned with the empote impote thing, once I knew the right word, I knew the right word. Then I was like, okay, I get it. I wasn't punished. They didn't say, you said impote, so you do not get your pho. No, they still gave me what I bought. I was not punished at all, but I actually learned. We need to get ourselves out of this idea of thinking that if we say something incorrectly or a little bit different or a little bit wrong, that somehow it's a zero sum game, that there is a perfect and there is a wrong, and that if you don't say it exactly how it is, that somehow you're going to have zero, that you are going to be punished. And Kaufmann talks a lot about this, and I absolutely agree that the way in which we've learned languages at schools creates a punishment system that makes it that people don't want to learn the language, to be able to communicate, that they want to learn it perfectly, and that actually really, really slows down the learning process. Now, there are a few things that I want to add to this when it comes to learning English and looking at this perfectionism, because I do think that there are two types of perfectionists. So, the first type of perfectionists I would have to say are the ones who want to get the grammar correct all the time. They feel that they need to have the perfectly structured grammatical sentence, or if it's word choice, they need to pick the absolute perfect word or pronunciation. They need to pronounce a word exactly, which is kind of funny because you can find words, and depending on where you are, the pronunciation for those words will differ. Okay, so for example, process and process. Process, they say in Canada. Process, we say here in the United States. Sometimes you hear some Americans say process, sometimes you hear some Canadians say process, right? So we don't even agree on the pronunciation here, but some students and some people learning English are so focused on, I need to be 100% correct with grammar, word choice, pronunciation, that they're more obsessed with that than the conversation itself. So you have those people that really focus on wanting to make sure the structure of their English is absolutely correct. Now, the second thing I want to talk about are those people who are perfectionists and how slow they actually speak the language, because they're constantly thinking about being perfect in the language. So as they're speaking to you, they slow down because they're trying to use the perfect grammar, the perfect words, the perfect pronunciation, which we already talked about it's subjective to where you are. They try to be so perfect, it actually slows down what they want to say, because they're looking for that perfect grammar. They're looking for that elusive adjective that nobody ever uses. But as I've said in another video, there's a reason why nobody uses those adjectives, because nobody uses them. But there is this, I need to use this structure. I need to use this fancy word. I need to use this fancy phrase, or I need to use this idiom. But the problem becomes, and this goes back to the native speaker aspect, if you're using these adjectives, phrasal verbs, idioms, and so on out of context, it will sound out of context. But back to the main point, which was that it slows people down because they're thinking of, what idiom can I use in this situation? You're kind of rolling the dice. You're thinking about the idiom in this situation, but then you got to make sure it's the right idiom for that situation, which again connects more culturally than it does as far as the language. Now, let me give you an example as to what I would rather hear as a native English speaker. And I have both sides of these, that people I interact with. On one side, I will talk to people who are talking about, at the same rate that I am. We're having a conversation going back and forth between ideas, yada, yada, yada. We're talking and all that. They're making grammatical mistakes. They're making some pronunciation mistakes. But the context of what they're talking about, I could figure out what word they're saying based on the conversation. So somebody might say, yes, I own a private corporation. Now it's private corporation, but I know if the rest of the sentence, yes, I own a private corporation, I can figure out what they're saying. But the conversation is flowing. Yes, maybe they're making conjugation mistakes. Yes, they're maybe forgetting or changing some of the prepositions or whatnot, but the conversation is flowing and going. Now, on the other hand, I have somebody over here who is trying to be a perfectionist. When they're trying to be a perfectionist, they slow down because they're looking for the right words, They're looking for the right way to structure a sentence. They're looking for, as I mentioned, some elusive adjective that maybe people don't use, trying to find that right idiom, and they're slowing down because they're trying to be perfect. And in many cases, they almost overthink it, that they make mistakes. Who, as a native English speaker, would I rather speak to? I mean, this goes against the grain of teaching English, but I'd rather talk to that first person, because we're able to have a conversation that's understandable and going with the flow that I like it at. If I'm talking to somebody else who is constantly thinking and constantly trying to be perfect, that conversation becomes slow. That conversation does not become interactive. That conversation becomes cumbersome. And we get to that point where it's like, okay, I got to go. Okay. So this is a problem. And if you are in that aspect of constantly wanting to be perfect, you're trying to get to 0% error correction, which Steve Kaufmann and others have said is very detrimental to learning the language. You want the errors, you want the mistakes. And when those people make a mistake, if let's say they're my students, they're not always my students, but if they are my students, they make a conjugation mistake or they make a preposition mistake, I tell them they made a mistake. That's my job. That's what I'm supposed to do. So they do. If you don't get that error input, then that is going to be hurting your language learning abilities. That's really going to be hard. All right. Well, thank you all very much. I'll see you in the next video. Have a wonderful day wherever it is you are. Bye-bye.